I would just sit in my room, never leave, and it was like obvious signs of depression.
Since 2019, the number of teenage girls who have been suicidal has increased 50%.
In anything that I did, I couldn't find myself to be happy.
I just stopped going out of my room sort of at all.
I just didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to leave it alone.
I refer to this as the second pandemic.
The U.S. Surgeon General is sounding the alarm about a worsening mental health crisis among young people.
I'm deeply concerned as a parent and as a doctor that the obstacles this generation of young people face are unprecedented and uniquely hard to navigate.
In America and around the globe, it is being taken more seriously, so I feel like we're breaking the stigma there, but there's still so much talk and work that needs to be had on mental health.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I'm Michele Norris, and I'm delighted to have our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, with us, and Elyse Fox and Cynthia Germanotta. Thank you for talking to us at this moment on this topic. I cannot imagine a more important topic right now, and to be doing it in this moment. So let's have a rich and wonderful conversation, and I think we're all going to learn a lot. Doctor, I want to begin with you. First, I want to thank you on behalf of the audience, on behalf of the nation, for elevating this issue. You have taken it, you have put in it. If I hear people wanting to clap, it's okay to give him his flowers. Because you have taken this issue and you have put it front and center in a way that we have not seen, and it's so important. I'm so happy to be with you today. I appreciate that you lead with your heart, and that you bring a healthy dose of empathy to the work that you do. So thank you for that. Before I ask you a question though, your advisory about youth and mental health during the pandemic illuminated some startling facts, and I think it's worth sort of marinating in this for a minute before we begin the conversation. The number of high school students who reported feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased by 40% in just one decade, from 2009 to 2019. And 19% of high school students considered attempting suicide in that same decade before the pandemic. That was before the pandemic. And we've seen the effects of the isolation of the pandemic and social media also. And we're now hearing more and more about something, a word that I think was new or maybe even foreign to some of us, the idea of suicide ideation. You know, that people who don't act on it are thinking about it. It's animating their thoughts. So now that we're not done with the pandemic, but perhaps on the downside, how do you think the collective trauma of the years that we experienced with the news about climate change, every other week there's a new movie about the apocalypse. I happen to like the idea of tomorrow, so I'm sort of overserved on that. And social media as well. What has all of this done to our mental health collectively, but particularly for young people?
Well, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and and I appreciate your kind words, but I also just want to say that the two extraordinary women who are here on this stage, and many others in the community, have all been a part of lifting up this issue and helping us all understand what is going on, why it's so critical for us to act right now. And so a couple of things I think that are just important to recognize. One is that, picking up what you were saying, Michele, yes, the pandemic did make things worse for a lot of people. It increased a sense of isolation. It created extraordinary stress in people's lives and uncertainty as well. And I don't think that we have fully processed what has gone on during the pandemic, that we have, at a personal level and as a community, the loss we experienced, the loss of loved ones, but also the loss of routine, certainty, relationships. Those are profound losses. There was trauma that people experienced in their life. And we can't just switch off that trauma and then go back to 2019 and the way of life then. We have to understand what happened to us. We have to be able to think through it, understand it, but also figure out how we want to make our lives different going forward. Because this is the bright side of tragic moments like what we experienced in the last couple of years, which is that we are sometimes able to extract from them meaning that can actually make our post-pandemic lives better, right? Because we are wiser and more thoughtful about how we lead them. But the second thing I just want to say is about how was happening before the pandemic. Because the truth is a lot of what was driving the mental health crisis among young people and more broadly in our country was happening before the pandemic. You think about the existential crises that young people were faced with, thinking about climate change, racism, violence in their communities. I mean, those three enough, would make somebody think, hey, is the future really as bright as the past? And many young people would say that. But you also look at the factors that are unique to how young people are growing up today, the technology that they are growing up with, which has certainly positive elements to it. And technology and social media can be a place where we come together and where we can, in the right circumstances, build community. But it also can be used in ways that tear us apart, that make us feel worse about ourselves, that ultimately hamper and harm our relationships with one another. And that has happened to too many people. One of the most common things young people say to me about social media when I talk to them in roundtables around the country is they say three things. One, it makes me feel worse about myself. Two, it makes me feel worse about my friendships. And three, I can't get off of it. Right? Those three things are what they say. And so that's a unique in the technology environment they're growing up in that is different from what many of us grew up with. That leads also to increased exposure to cyberbullying and other traumas. But the last thing I would just keep in mind is this. The pace of change has just dramatically increased, around the world. Like everything from how we think about jobs and the skills that you need for the future, to the basic bargain that many people assumed we had, which was that if you work hard and you follow the rules and you're a good person, that life will work out for you. How we think about everything from gender to sexuality to race, like so much of this has shifted and changed for people in the last few years. And change, even good change, is hard, right? Like I know, I'm a dad of a 4 and a 6-year-old, and I'm just cherishing this time I have with them. But I know someday, hopefully if we do our job right, they will finish school and they'll leave home. And even though that's a good outcome, that they are healthy, they're happy, they're leaving the nest, I know that I'm going to be just like on the floor in tears
when
that happens. Yes,
you absolutely are.
Absolutely. All that to say that even good change can be hard. And we are asking young people and people across society to engage and endure and navigate a degree of change that truly is unprecedented. So you put all this together, and you can understand why the stresses and strains on this generation are truly unique. And we have to understand that. And that means not only making sure that treatment is available to them, but thinking about these forces and how we mitigate them. That means that addressing climate change and violence and racism isn't just something we do because it's the right thing to do. We also do it because it's affecting mental health. Shaping technology so that it actually supports our relationships and supports our mental health is vital. Just putting it out there as a grand social experiment to be visited upon the entire country and the world is not always the most responsible thing to do. So we have a lot of work to do, but lastly say this is why I feel encouraged, because we're already starting on the path of doing it. Conversations like this are incredibly powerful. These two incredible leaders who are next to me are part of a community of leaders who are helping to push these issues to the forefront. And in the administration, we've also worked hard to invest unprecedented amounts in training more mental health providers, applying technology to improve access to care, and ensuring that we're investing unprecedented amounts in the prevention programs that are so desperately needed, as well as setting up 988, which is a crisis line that we need for help. So anyway, a lot of reasons to be hopeful, but still a good lot of work that we've got to do together.
Elyse and Cynthia, I'm going to bring you into this, but since you mentioned the administration, one quick question on that. Some time ago, the military made a change in their footing around mental health. There was a time where if you came back and you suffered from PTSD or you were feeling unshaky or unsure of yourself after experiencing 1 or 2 or 3 theaters of war, you got help if you raised your hand. And sometime after the Gulf War, they changed their footing and decided that there was an assumption that anyone who had experienced war was in need of some kind of help. It was just a spectrum. How much help did they need? Is that something that applies to all of us on the other side of what we have just been through? And I'm wondering if the administration would ever consider or commit to creating something like I don't necessarily like the word czar, but a mental health czar, someone who, almost like we do in the cases of Ebola or the case of economic tumult, one person who's working across agencies to actually address these issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I like the example you shared about the military. You move from an opt-in to an opt-out to an opt-in, right? Where you provide people with a basic level of inquiry and support, and you ratchet it up for people who need more support. But you don't assume that just because somebody's not raising their hand that they don't need help. Think about college campuses. That's a place where I think we should be taking a similar approach. We should make care and support available proactively to everyone. And if they don't need much, then that's great. Then they don't need to utilize as much. But we'll find that many people have silent needs that go unaddressed. I think this gets to a critical point here, which is around how we define strength. And this is why your example of the military is actually very poignant, because, and I say this as a doctor who was trained in programs where strength was defined in a very particular way, right? As in medicine, in the military, and society, historically, we've said, well, strength is not depending on anyone else. Strength is not showing other people if you're struggling. Strength is being stoic, right? Strength is never being vulnerable, right? I will tell you, none of those definitions of strength feel like they really define strength. I look at the young people who are stepping up today and bravely, courageously sharing their own struggles and experiences and giving hope to other people, and I say, you know what? Vulnerability is strength. I look at the people who are courageously speaking out for people who are struggling, even if they themselves are doing okay. They're advocating for those who are in need, and I'm saying that courage is strength. And I'm looking at people who are also empathetic and kind and loving in this moment. Think about the nurses and doctors and respiratory therapists who ran to the front lines to help during the pandemic. That love, that kindness, that empathy is strength. So we need to redefine strength in our culture. This is the moment to do it. And if we do that coming through this pandemic, we will have found certainly a powerful silver lining.
So when you talk about young people who are telling their story as an example of strength, we have a very strong example of that right here on stage with us, with Elyse, in creating the Sad Girls Club, in telling your story, and continuing to use social media to create community, which is a positive use of social media. How has the stigma around this changed? And this is really a question I'd like to hear from both of you on. When people actually use their platforms, use their voices to tell their story and create a sense of community, does it chip away at that stigma? Have you seen changes in that?
Absolutely. I definitely have seen it from my own experience, just sharing my own perspective of what depression, anxiety looks like for me and for women of color. And it's honestly the hardest thing to do is to be the first one or to take that first step into being vulnerable on social media. Everyone wants to show like the highlight reel or what's perfect or what perfection looks like from their vantage point. But I honestly get the most beautiful and authentic commentary when I speak about the worst times that I'm having, or if I'm not done up and speaking about my experiences and like what I'm struggling with. And I think we need more of that. We put a lot of pressure on the apps and say like, these apps are bad, but these apps are actually tools for us to connect with each other and create our own communities. But we've used it and we've kind of shifted it to just show the perfection. So I like to use my platform to not just show the good times, but also to highlight the bad times and say like, look, I know I have this platform, I have this business, and things might look like they're going okay, doing really well, but I still need help, I still need support. So it shows even after years of coming out with my depression, it doesn't stop. Like you don't get a certain amount of followers or accrue this much money and your depression stops. And I want people to just understand that there's no stopping point, but there's also a place where we can build community and build a sustainable and long-term conversation. So I definitely see in the stigma not diminished, but it's definitely depleted, and people have found their voices in Sad Girls Club. And then I also see a lot of other platforms that have blossomed that are supplying these conversations to more niche communities, the LGBTQ community, the AAPI, and I think that is so beautiful because everyone's experiences are so unique, but when you find that sweet spot, especially on social media, there are billions of people on social media, and we should have a place where we feel like can be our own digital home, and we've created that through Sad Girls Club, but I love to see even the small micro communities and lifting them up to say like, look, this isn't my experience, but this may help you, and with vulnerability and speaking about every aspect of my life. I think it's very scary.
You do speak about almost every aspect. You put it out there.
Yes, I put everything out there because it's so important. I have nieces, I have a niece and I have a nephew and I have a 3-year-old son, and these conversations are so difficult for them to have, and to be on social media and to not only just see, oh, your aunt is perfect, or I don't even like that word perfect. No one is perfect. You can have it all.
Perfect is overrated.
It's overrated. It's overrated. We have to really be real and show every parts of ourselves, and I think that's the best way to heal in community, especially if we can't be together. And the pandemic obviously restricted connection in person, but to have that space where you know you're seen, heard, and also you don't even have to speak, you just understand someone else's experiences as your own, it's a game changer.
Cynthia, you created the Born This Way Foundation in part because of personal experience, watching your daughter struggle. And when we hear the words Born This Way, many of us think immediately of the song. You think of strength, you think of it as almost like an anthem. But behind that is a good deal of this vulnerability. And I'm wondering if you know, the question about what you've seen change in terms of people using their voice, if that's chipped away at the stigma, but also because you have an experience of watching a daughter go through this without your daughter, Lady Gaga, in case everybody didn't know, go through this before we saw social media blossom and become what it is today. So could you talk about a little bit about both those things, the stigma, but also what you've seen in terms of how people can cope, good and bad, with the forces that we have now?
Yeah, and I mean, Elyse, I would agree with you. I think the stigma, it is breaking down, but it still very much exists. And, you know, an amazing way for young people to overcome that is when we model healthy conversations about that and are vulnerable ourselves as parents. I mean, you know, one of the biggest reasons that young people don't speak to their parents about their issues is because their parents don't share theirs. You know, we come from like the time of true grit and, you know, to buck up and get on with it. And they also feel judged. So it's really important to model healthy conversations for young people to start to break down that stigma, you know, in communities. With my daughter, I didn't see it coming. I wish as a parent that I understood some of the warning signs between just normal biological behavior of, you know, an adolescent, you know, young woman and a real problem. So I really didn't see that coming with her. But it was her courage and her bravery to share her story because she was so deeply impacted by it that allowed other young people to realize that there's hope, that there were ways to overcome it. And most interestingly to me is despite the many issues and the layers, Dr. Murthy, that you outlined, the layers of social issues that young people are dealing with, they're very aspirational. There's a great sense of altruism. They want to help themselves, they want to help one another. And so we're working very hard to try to equip them with the proper tools to do that in forms of like peer-based education so that they can support one another and talk about mental health, because we know from our research that when they're in a crisis, they would prefer to talk to a peer. So we really believe that mental health training should be in all schools, both what is mental health and how to talk to, you know, how to talk to a peer. As well as embedding kindness in communities. I think these are the things that will help build supportive communities, that will help tear down the stigma by embedding kindness. And that can happen in many ways and shapes and forms. But we do know that there's this inextricable link between kindness and mental health, because we know that young people that report being in kind communities are mentally healthier. They generally have higher mental health indicator scores. But back to my daughter, I mean, her mental health journey started in middle school, and it began with loneliness, you know, bullied, excluded, things that took a very confident young woman and made her question her value and her self-worth. And yes, this was pre-social media, but when she reached college, I mean, it followed her from middle school to college. And when she reached college, there were some young people that started a Facebook page about her that was very, very negative. It's still out there and, you know, extremely hurtful. It lives in perpetuity, right? And it follows you. So.
Let's make America kind again.
Let's make America kind again.
I wonder how you dealt with your own trepidation, because when she started using her voice, were you at all worried about how vulnerable she was making herself to the outside world? As parents, you want to applaud every decision your child makes, but sometimes secretly you're like, oh, please, I'm worried about how people will react. Sometimes it's, because they're wearing something or they get a tattoo, or many of us have dealt with that. But when you're talking about something as close as mental health, did you have to swallow hard and swallow your own fears when she started to show the bravery to use her own voice?
I absolutely did. And this is where I like to talk about intergenerational differences. We didn't talk about these issues in my home. I mean, we're all parents and we probably have different experiences from our parents, but we didn't talk about those issues. So when she gained her voice, so to speak, and began talking publicly, I didn't quite understand it. I kept saying to her, why are you being so private in public? But I came to see how this was resonating with young people. They were healing, she was healing. They were gaining courage. They were leaving feeling empowered, that there was hope for them. And we saw the enormity of this issue as we traveled, the world. But certainly as a parent, it was very hard for me to hear that. And I felt many, many different things. My own guilt. I felt so badly for her, for what she went through, and, could I have helped her, even more? You talked earlier, Dr. Murthy, about prevention. We deal so often with prevention and intervention and cure, which is very important, right? Prevention and intervention. But there's this in-between stage. I spoke to a young woman from Morocco the other day, Fatima, and she talks about the missing middle. That there are so many young people and people in general, we don't know what spectrum they're on of mental health. They're in there somewhere, but they kind of get lost. And it's not uncommon to go years, sometimes 10 years without being diagnosed for mental health. That happened to my daughter. So just the importance of that, I started to realize how important it was for her to share her conversation. And one thing I'm encouraged about also as a parent, many parents now are seeing that their children are exhibiting signs of mental health. They're becoming more educated. And very recently, a panel of experts in the U.S. Prevention Council is asking for mental health screenings from all primary doctors the ages of 8 through 18. I think this is something that could help us with that missing middle. To capture young people that are struggling and their parents aren't seeing it. They may be feeling it, but they're not understanding what they're going through.
I'm interested for all three of you, and I'm going to work backwards on this because we just have a few minutes left, on your thoughts about regulating the things that we can regulate. So climate change, there are things that we can do, and actually individual action will add up to something quite large, and the decisions we make about how we travel, the cars we drive, the way that we get rid of our waste and recycling. But there's other forces that are hard to deal with because someone else is at the lever. And that's certainly true for social media. So is it something that we do as a nation need to think about regulating or modulating in some way? And what are the challenges around that? Because unlike, say, smoking, you don't have a body of scientific research that you can readily call upon to look at the effects of smoking on someone's health. If you're looking at the effects of something like social media on someone's health, how do we deal with something that at this point is still a little bit squishy in trying to make decisions about how to regulate something? If I can get all three
in
to
terms of all of the social issues you mentioned, it's very challenging. Just trying to process that type of trauma that we're seeing, whether we're adults or young people, is extremely challenging. It's putting added layers of stress on young people. I think it's making parents less productive. One of the psychiatrists that we listen to quite often is Dr. Rihanna Anderson, who talks about that, how it's actually exacerbating the mental health, the anxiety and depression among young people, but also making their parents less productive. In terms of channeling it, if we can possibly channel that into action as a community. It sounds very simple, and I know that it's difficult, but the smallest things that we can do, whether it's gun control, whether it is embedding that kindness, in communities. One of the things we're doing at the foundation is investing in grassroots mental health organizations that are meeting the needs of young people who are experiencing all of this trauma. It's called the Kindness in Community Fund. This past summer, we invested $1 million in 22 organizations in local communities, visited them all, learned about them, worked with them, and we're seeing this tremendous impact that they're having, and we're planning to double that to $2 million in the coming years. So any things we can do that are actionable to actually take steps in our communities, as small as they might be and as difficult as they might be in the midst of our own healing.
Elyse, do we need to regulate or modulate these forces in some way? And until we see any kind of official action, what can be done?
I agree with you. I really focus on the micro changes because this is new for a lot of people. These conversations are so brand new. So I even talk about like how storytelling is the eldest form of healing. We pass down remedies, we pass down recipes, but you don't know what your grandmother's mental health was. I think having these honest and open conversations about what the generational impact of mental health in your own specific family is so helpful, and it helps you feel not alone off the bat, but also encouraging those conversations within your own friend group. You have a text group with your friends, you talk about dating, you talk about going out, but have you asked your friend how their mental health is? Is there anything that's on their plate that you can help take off? Or just adding that kindness to these normal conversations and not being so focused on what's on social media. We do have to set our own parameters with these apps that we use because we shouldn't be taking in all this information all the time. And there's a lot that we can't restrict ourselves from seeing. So until we can, and until it's better moderated, we have to do it for ourselves. But I do think having those micro conversations really helps remove the stigma, normalizes the conversation, and also spreads more awareness. Maybe within your friend group, they'll ask their families, how's your mental health? Or I noticed this type of behavior. Can we have a conversation about that? So I work on a micro level and really hoping to expand what that means for communities.
There's a well-known writer that I spoke to recently who said, on the fact that these are addictive. There is an app that you can get on the phone which will lock you out of social media. And she does it to help with her writing. And she finds that she turns it on and wants to get back to it. And she can't get back to it. But maybe we could all do that every so often to just turn it all off. We don't have much time. But on the issue of regulating or modulating the forces of social media, is this something the government should be doing?
I do think there's a role for government here, particularly with two things. One, with ensuring data transparency. We need to know what the impact of these platforms are on young people. There is data there, but independent researchers tell us that they're not getting that data from companies. The second is in safety standards. Most of the things that I have in my house, Michele, are things that had to meet some safety standard to be sold to me. Yet we have these platforms that billions of people are using around the world that do not have clear enough and strong enough safety standards. I don't think it's reasonable to expect the industry is going to police itself, grade its own homework. We shouldn't expect that or want that. That standard needs to come from the outside. But finally, I'll just say this too.
Is it government's role to do that?
I do think government has an important role to play there because right now it's not clear who else is going to do that. And right now the companies are policing themselves, which is not working out in the favor of our children. But finally, just keep this in mind. If we want to address the broader youth mental health crisis, one of the critical things that we have to do is we have to stitch together the social fabric of our country again. That means we have to rebuild relationships. We have to refocus on creating healthy relationships, giving young people the skills, tools, and opportunities to do that. Because the science is incredibly clear on this now that our relationships with one another are directly connected to both our mental health and our physical health. And record numbers of young people, and people, frankly, across the age spectrum, are struggling with loneliness and isolation. And the reason that is so important is because our relationships don't just feel good. They don't just make our minds and bodies do better, but they are vehicles through which we reinforce and strengthen our values. The values that I want for my children when they grow up. Like I want my kids, my son and daughter, to grow up in a world where people are kind to one another, where if they stumble and fall down, there'll be somebody to pick them up, and they'll do the same. I want a world where people are generous, where they look out for one another and not just themselves. And I want them to grow up in a world that's driven and fueled by love and not by fear. those values have to be more than platitudes we put on a wall. It's our relationships that allow us to live out those values, to experience them, to recognize how powerful they are, and to be reminded by our friends that these are the values that actually matter. So the bottom line is, if we want to address mental health in America, yes, we need to increase access to treatment. Yes, we have to invest in prevention programs. Yes, we have to break down the stigma. We also have to rebuild our relationships with one another. And that can start today with the steps you take to reach out to people in your life, to help strangers who may be in need, and to reinforce these core values of kindness, generosity, and love.
I'm going to add one, gratitude. I think that that is something that we can all express to others and to ourselves to take care of our mental health. And I have great gratitude for all of you and the time that you've spent. Thank you so much, Dr. Murthy, Elyse Fox, Cynthia Germanotta. Thank you so much.
Thank you.